comprehensive plan meeting from the Board of Trustees, April 29th, 2025. If everyone would please stand and join me for the pledge of allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. All right, let's get started. Max, want to get us going?
Okay, so, hello, Board Mayor. I have provided you with a memorandum, sort of looking at steps toward completing seeker and considering adoption of the comprehensive plan. I have reviewed the significant amount of comments that have been received by the village, both before and after the public hearing was closed. And I am, in response to those comments, recommending a few changes to the comprehensive plan for your consideration tonight. The first change I'm recommending is not really in response to comments, it's more sort of to continue the plan. The plan always sort of left the process description up front, hanging as far as what steps were taken. That can now be completed, so I've included some verbiage here for you, referring to the public hearing and the adoption of the plan, if you so choose tonight. With regard to recommendation D1, you will recall this was a recommendation of the comprehensive plan to consider PUDs up on the school property up at 9W. The CPC had already amended that recommendation to remove specific reference to the school property. A statement was remained that said the 9W corridor is an area suitable for planned mixed-use development of higher densities, where transportation access is excellent and there are few environmental constraints. I'm now recommending that that be taken out. I think it was sort of unnecessary at this point. It did identify an area that could be potential, but I think it was clear that it was unnecessarily controversial and objectionable.
And let me just say, we do have some copies of the changes. If anyone wants to come up, we have some here. You want to see them.
With regard to recommendation D4, this was a recommendation that's being changed in response to a Rockland County planning comment, which is that we should specifically indicate that fire department volunteers need housing. So we're adding them specifically to satisfy Rockland County's comment. With regard to recommendation E6, this was a recommendation that the flood damage prevention law be amended to require an additional 30 inches of freeboard for any structure that's constructed over a flood hazard area. That was a very specific recommendation that said we should require structures to be raised such, and we're just suggesting that you soften it a little bit and say consider requiring. This is one of the zoning amendments that we're going to be working on over the next month. So if you decide at the end of that period that you don't want to adopt it, by making this change now, it sort of opens up that option a bit more. Recommendation E7, this was sort of an accompanying recommendation that allowed for flexibility in building height where you're requiring these structures to be raised with additional freeboard. That was a very specific recommendation, and it was written in a way that was very directive We are suggesting making the recommendation a little more open-ended, less defined, and making it more optional so that you can consider whatever zoning is developed by us over the next month, make changes to it. It's not so prescriptive. The previous recommendation said we should allow building height to be measured 54 inches above the base flood elevation. So the bottom of that building height's measurement would start there. And when you consider the sort of fabric of the village, especially the waterfront, that could lead to significantly taller houses in certain areas of the village. So we do understand the comment that was received and we agree with it. And this would allow, I think we put some verbiage in here that additionally the village cap the height increase in a manner that would avoid character impacts to the neighborhood. So that gives you a little more flexibility to decide what's appropriate and what's inappropriate for the village when you consider adopting that zoning. Recommendation E15, this is again a recommendation of the Rockland County Planning Department. They suggested that you add the fact that the current climate smart coordinator position is vacant and should be filled. So we did include that. Lastly, several commenters noted that there were a number of recommendations that were identified as concurrent with plan adoption. This is a sort of part of the process. The CPC had recommended a couple dozen recommendations for you to consider to adopt concurrent with plan adoption. Obviously, you chose a few, 3. And so the other change we're making is to clarify that anything you didn't choose to be concurrent with plan adoption is now a short-term recommendation. Also, we did consider the words concurrent with plan adoption. I mean, I think it's clear that we started this zoning process at the same time as the plan adoption process. I don't think we need to change that verbiage just to indicate that we're not adopting any zoning immediately, but we're going to consider it over the next short amount of time. There will need to be additional seeker, that we will give you the paperwork when you're considering those local laws.
Mayor, if I may, one question on that. That comment about E6, 7, and F3, right? Everything has been removed from concurrent to either short term, but E6 has to do with requiring structures to be 30 inches higher, right?
Correct.
There's no current legislation now, but it's anticipated that in the near future, which is also short term, maybe shorter term for the board to consider.
Yes, correct. And to clarify the contract for the village, there was a women's business enterprise that teamed with us that had available budget left. I've asked them to assist us on drafting that zoning. And I asked them to try and get drafts to the village by the end of May. My firm will be drafting that 4th amendment that was recommended by Rockland County Planning that will have you review this plan annually. That was a suggestion, and I think everybody agreed that was a good sort of additional piece to add to the process here.
Sorry, Mayor, I know it wasn't a big part of this, so when I asked, just to clarify the record, so E6 would be to elevate, there'll be legislation to elevate above 30 inches more, and the purpose of that is for flooding purposes?
Yeah, right now, if you build a structure, you have to provide 2 feet of freeboard against above the advisory base flood elevations, which is already higher than the adopted base flood elevations. But the Comprehensive Plan Committee recognized that the current actual flood elevations in reality when it floods are probably the advisory base flood elevations, not the adopted FEMA flood elevations. So the idea is to require a further 30 inches of freeboard over that to allow for any structure that's built tomorrow to not sort of be subject to sea level rise for the next through 2050.
So E6 and E7 are sort of together, and it's a benefit that would require certain construction above a level to mitigate flood impacts.
That's correct, to protect future real estate from flood damage, correct?
Okay, and then the other one was sorry, now I understand, the other one was F3, which is enhanced provisions related to steep slopes. What we've
That's
done
correct.
there. Same concept of in the near future, new legislation.
Yeah, by the end of May, we're gonna have a local law. We're gonna look at the current zoning allows in several, or requires in several different locations, protection of steep slopes. We're gonna make sure that that is very clear, very concise, and protects to the maximum extent possible.
So again, a more conservative route in developing on steep slopes.
Correct.
To mitigate impacts from that property and downhill properties.
Correct.
Thank you, sorry, man. I may ask some tough questions.
So I think that one of the things that we're considering tonight are the adoption of a Part 2 and Part 3 EAF, Environmental Assessment Form. You'll recall previously that when you circulated this draft plan to Rockland County Planning Department, you had adopted a Part 1. And that Part 1 included at the end a matrix, and that matrix essentially went through and described the recommendations of the comprehensive plan and considered those recommendations against a wide variety of environmental impacts that are included in the Part 2 EAF form. This is sort of the standard first phase of seeker that you go through to make sure that when you're considering an action, that the action not have any of those impacts. We had done that. We have further prepared a Part 2 tonight. So that sort of is for every single policy in the plan. We went through the impacts listed in the Part 2. But seeker says you should be adopting a Part 2. So what we did is we prepared a Part 2 that corresponds to that previous analysis in the Part 1, where an impact was identified for one policy. It's considered to apply to the whole plan, and so that's how the Part 2 reads. So that is sort of like a compilation of all the potential impacts that were identified, I think for approximately 4, maybe 5 recommendations of the plan. So that's your Part 2 form. And your Part 3, sort of when you fill out the Part 2, you're identifying that some element of the plan could have a moderate or large impact. The terms moderate or large refer to whether the thresholds indicated in the EAF form are in fact met. So if you're going to result in disturbance of land, yes, you identify land impact. Then you take that impact and then you further consider it in the Part 3 to then determine if that moderate or large impact will result in a significant adverse environmental impact, which is the threshold for requiring an environmental impact statement. So your Part 3 form, as being recommended, starts with a description of proposed action. And it makes sort of a few very necessary considerations. One is that this village, the oldest village in Rockland County, was started in 1847. And then you've had zoning in this village since 1977. And there's not, frankly, a lot left that hasn't been built. So it also talks about, this is your first comp plan. A lot of communities have already adopted comp plans 20, 30, 40 years ago. This is your first, but it's not like previous to this comp plan, the courts would have found that you didn't have a plan. They would have discussed what's considered a well-considered plan, and the well-considered plan would have been the sum of all of your land use policy decisions over the recent past and your zoning ordinance as it exists today. So when you talk about the adoption of this plan, and the impact of its policies, you're doing it not against a background where nothing would happen. You're doing it against a background where anything that would happen would be consistent with your current zoning and your current land use policies, right? So the types of variances that you issue, the type of planning board approvals that you issue, those as a collective become your de facto comp plan since you don't have an adopted one. So that's sort of how we view these policies, not in a vacuum, but based on your current practice. Comp plans, and I've said this to you a bunch of times, don't authorize anything, right? Comp plan is implemented through your zoning ordinance, your subdivision regulations, your flood hazard prevention law, all of these actual laws. So comp plans don't carry the weight of law, and they don't actually result in any physical changes or projects in the community. So what they do is, to the extent that the language is prescriptive, is they require you to have your zoning in harmony with the plan. So if they say you should adopt, previously stated, 30 inches of freeboard over your advisory-based flood elevations, that is highly prescriptive. It would be very inconsistent for you to not do it. So a lot of the comprehensive plan recommendations, in order to give you appropriate degrees of flexibility, talk about considering, suggesting, requiring further study, and that gives you a lot more latitude to act with sort of independence of the exact current conditions. So if things change, you get a little latitude to adjust to them. As you take further study of certain subjects, you're not bound to a strict course, and that's fairly that's fairly common. Seeker does require you, however, to consider any time your plan commits you to a further course of action. So to the extent that you are committed to a certain course of action, you should be reviewing the environmental impacts of that. We talk also, again, that the village is built out. We'll talk about the analysis that was done, that based on just zoning without consideration of environmental constraints for steep slopes, wetlands, and other factors, 72 residential units could have been constructed over 19 sites totaling 23 acres village-wide. So if you did nothing and somebody came in and sought the maximum development and they didn't have to contend with the slope ordinances and the wetland ordinance, the maximum you'd end up with is 72 units. We know that that's probably actually even less. And so I think the last piece here is that, and this was something that at least Bruce and Nate were standing here. I think, Mark, you were here when we started the CPC. Michael, I don't remember. Christine, you're newer. When we were starting this conversation, we looked to the end of this process and said, village, you're gonna get to the end of this process and you're gonna either do, you know, a $8,000 to $12,000 neg deck process, or you're going to do a $20,000 to $35,000 EAS process. The neg deck process is gonna take a few months. The EIS process is gonna take 6 months, and the defining factor of what gets you to one or other is whether any of the policy recommendations you're making are going to result in a significant adverse impact. And I think the village board specifically said, well, we're not going to come out of this process with any recommendations that result in a significant adverse impact. And the lower threshold, lower budget, lower process was sufficient. And that's essentially where we are today. Is the Comprehensive Plan Committee was very attentive to making sure that this plan would not result in significant adverse impacts. And in considering all the public comment that came in, I was also very, very careful to consider any potential impacts. I do recommend, for example, that amendment to D1, because I don't think that statement in there would have resulted in an adverse impact, but I could see how it could be argued that it might. And I think it's fair to act conservatively after the effort that the CPC has put into this plan for 18 months, nights, weekends, 5 or 6 public outreach meetings. A lot of people spent a lot of time and a lot of love and care to develop this document, and it's 5 or 6 dozen recommendations, and I don't think it would be a good idea at the very end for this plan to be at risk because of a statement that could be construed as resulting in environmental impact. So I think that considered, this is a type 1 action. I think when type 1 actions are identified by DEC, it was sort of implicit that those type 1 actions could result or were likely to result in significant adverse impacts. I would say that when you consider comprehensive plans across the state in different communities, you have very large communities, you have very vacant communities with a lot of environmental resources, unbuilt land, and in those communities, comprehensive plans that have major shifts in land use and allow for multiple new uses and extensive new uses, yeah, they can result in environmental impacts. I don't think that's what you have in front of you. Even though it is type 1, seeker does say you're still allowed, if you haven't identified any environmental impacts, to adopt an ADEC. I think that the last thing we can talk about here is sort of the impacts that we had identified, or based on some policies. We had identified recommendation E6, which was the freeboard requirement, as resulting in impacts. You are requiring 2.5 feet more of building height. Might be important. We did look into that. We are suggesting that it is a de minimis increase, 2.5 feet. Already you have structures that are built at different elevations because I think it was in the last 10 years, the flood damage protection law was already amended to require freeboard over the advisory base flood elevations, which are 2 feet higher than the adopted. So you have a village that was adopted with freeboard over 8 feet, and then at some point it was changed to 10 feet. And what we're really doing now is we're changing that to 12.5 feet, right? So I don't think that that's a significant adverse impact. I also, in terms of the comprehensive plan, and we can take that back up when you have that law in front of you. But for now, the other thing is, again, add the flexibility for you that doesn't commit you to that standard. And I think that also sort of allows you to say that this isn't committing you, and therefore there's not going to be an environmental impact on that.
Max, your comment on that, your thought process says it may be some aesthetic impact, but you find that it's de minimis.
Yeah, it's a character impact. Yeah, you have a row of houses now that are constructed at 8 or 10 and 12 feet above sea level, and now you're coming in and you're requiring the next one to be 14.5. That's somebody could say that it is an impact. I don't think it's a big impact. But I also think by providing the flexibility for this board to not adopt that change, you're allowing them to take it up again when the details of that law are being considered. Because maybe there's some variation of it that if there is going to be an impact, can overcome that.
The benefit is a benefit.
Yeah, and I think there is a benefit to it, absolutely. But that's not the threshold for the initial seeker. The initial seeker is just, it can't have a significant adverse impact. And so if the board as lead agency in reviewing that law determined maybe there is, then they could always do an EIS, and then they could do the seeker calculus and weigh and balance benefit versus impact. But I think, again, we're splitting hairs. This is 2.5 feet. And it's only on new structures. So over time, this is gonna happen anyway. Nobody's gonna spend a lot of money for a structure that's gonna be damaged in the first big flood that comes down the Hudson River. So
Just to clarify, new and substantially improved, yeah?
new and or substantially improved, right? So it's current flood hazard law threshold.
Right.
I think it's like 50% damage over the foundation, something like that. So the next one really has to do with E7. And that is allowing relief from the zoning height requirements where a building now has to go up 2.5 feet. So you're making them going up to 2.5 feet. The CPC felt like it was appropriate to allow them some relief on the other side so that if everybody on the street has a 2-story home, now they don't have to have a 1-story because they're going up 30 inches. That said, I think that it's fair that the way we had it written previously, where we were just requiring 54 inches over the base flood elevation, I do some calculations here. You can have a house whose maximum height is 40 feet, and this law would allow the next house over to be at 51.5 feet. So 11.5 feet higher on a 25-foot tall house, which is what you have in the WF1, WF2 zoning districts, is going to be noticeable. It's going to be a significant impact to character. So we thought it was a good idea, again, to make that more flexible, give you the ability to address whether or not there's going to be a character impact and appropriately draft the zoning so there is no aesthetic impact at such time that you take it up, which is hopefully in about a month.
So we went from prescriptive to consider.
Consider, prescriptive, and again, less prescribed. So there were 3 specific provisions for measuring building height, and that's been taken out. It's just been said, give some relief, make sure it doesn't impact aesthetic or community resources. The next one had to do with impacts to surface water and flooding from elevation of roadways. So one of sort of the standard reactions to the sea level rise impacts are to consider elevating your existing roads. When you do that, there can be unintended consequences. You can be impacting adjacent property by reducing the flood storage area, and you can also be impounding waters as they recede because you've raised the roadways. There's a lot to consider there. We thought that, from a first reading, this could be construed as having an adverse impact. I think that as written now, there is enough discussion here recognizing this as a potential impact, suggesting further study, suggesting cost-benefit considerations, that it's not going to rise to the level of a significant adverse impact. And again, you're not committed to doing it. It's something that the CTC wants you to look at. The next one is about exploring dredging or other methods to restore the old mill pond. This is, again, the old mill pond is silted up. You have a lot of weeds growing. You have vegetation. It's sort of losing its open water feel. Members of the CPC really wanted to consider dredging. Dredging has the potential for impacts. There's no buts or ifs about that. There's also discussion about whether the dam should be removed. Removed for a time, allowed the silt to come out naturally, and then maybe replace it. Different approaches were considered. Nothing solid. That's why it was sort of left vague, recommended back to you for further consideration, cost-benefit analysis. Again, we think that the way that this is phrased in the comp plan is general enough that it's not committing you to the action, and you can take up those environmental considerations in the future if and when you take up this as an implementation item. So, the other thing that we always suggest and seeker requires you to consider is when you look at these impacts individually, right? You can sort of get fooled to saying small impact, small impact, small impact, but together they could have a cumulative impact. And so the last section says that you have considered the plan, you have considered the overall recommendations, sort of what this does to the community on an overall basis, and you're finding it doesn't result in cumulative impact. And again, I just point back to the whole reason this comprehensive plan was taken up. I said 18 months ago, previously, I think it's more than that, maybe, yeah, is the village got grants, right, to address sustainability, to address flooding, to address being more environmentally conscious. And that was the mandate, or one of the mandates of the committee throughout its work. And that sort of was the primary focus of this committee. That's not what you've been paying attention to recently. That's not what has captured the zeitgeist, if you will. But that was the reason, and that is what this plan mostly does. So I think on a cumulative basis, adopting the comp plan sets you on a path to better environmental stewardship, better historic stewardship, better stewardship of the community character, all of these factors. And again, I'd be remiss if I don't point to the work, and 3 of you were on the committee. One was a chairman, put considerable amount of time and effort into this plan. All the volunteers that worked on it, all the members of the public that came out for it over the course of those 2 years. So it is my recommendation that if you agree with me, that you do adopt the part 2, the part 3, and the negative declaration of environmental significance. I did separately provide a second memo to you regarding overriding of certain of the county's comments. I actually didn't print myself one of those. So I don't know if you had any questions. We sort of already went over this at the last meeting.
Mayor, may I ask a couple questions about something? I know you adopted at the last meeting the part 1, which would all be part of the secret findings, your hard look. You still have to take a hard look at this, and this is a very hard look.
Yeah.
There's some allegations that there's boilerplate EAF part 1, which I disagree with, but I wanted to ask Max and the board about some of these questions. Where you find that there's no potential for any environmental impact, and I'm just going to take a few randomly. E5, for instance, says, consider establishing an annual budget allocation toward ongoing grant research in writing for future resiliency project planning and implementation. And the part 1, which you adopted already, indicates that there's no potential for environmental impact.
Correct.
Now, can we just talk about, I'm gonna
Yeah,
take a few and ask about this just so.
Sure, so that is a recommendation that's really about continuing to do study, to continuing to seek funding, to support future planning, to support future work. When you go after grant funding, you have to comply with seeker when you apply for the grant. And then when you come out with a study, if you're gonna adopt the study, you usually have to go through seeker then. And if you're gonna implement something, a project that results in physical change, you certainly have to go through seeker at that point.
So just applying for grants is not gonna cause an environmental impact?
No, and the other point of that is,
It's a
again,
silly question probably, but I think it's important to go, and I wanna do a couple more if that's
Sure.
okay. E8 says encourage flood adaptation of existing structures, where the board already indicated that it would not have an impact, a potential impact on the environment. Same type of question I'd ask of you, is that,
yeah,
how
so
did we arrive there?
again, flood adaptation of existing structures, sort of a general term. That could be wet proofing a structure, so that could be making it so that it's designed to flood without holding back floods. It could be, actually that would be dry proofing. Wet proofing would be allowing the flood to come into the structure, so maybe the lower flowers, they can design a building to adapt to that. It might be relocation of a structure, where, you have a facility of the village right now that's located in the flood hazard area, but you consider relocation of it to somewhere where not. But in any of those instances, first of all, you're not specific enough to actually do a proper environmental assessment here. You don't know what that looks like, so you actually can't do an environmental assessment. And the recommendation isn't committing you a particular course of action. The idea behind the recommendation is that you're making your facilities more storm resilient. That's why there's no impact at this point.
Okay. In F2, it says situate developments in a manner that limits visual impacts to the community. In answer, there were no impacts. Can you walk us through that thought process?
Yeah, again, it's not specific. The idea is that the village should consider ways that when you do develop projects, that those wouldn't result in visual impacts. Visual impacts typically come from things like out of character development, right? So those type of recommendations might, for example, result in adoption of design guidelines or an architectural review process. But again, we're not identifying the specifics here. We're saying that this is a goal of the village, that we should have protection from visual impacts.
So these 5 pages attached to the part 1 aren't boilerplate analysis.
No, every single, and I've worked with my office, I worked with junior staff to go through each and every question. There was discussion, and the village board certainly should likewise have considered every policy in this plan and determined that you're comfortable that these aren't going to impact environment in any manner.
I assume the board agrees with all this analysis that was done in part 1, that's why you adopted it.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it. Sorry, man. Escaped a lot of it.
So is that what we're up to?
Yeah, do you want to do number 2, Mayor? Review and consider adoption of draft EAF part 2 and 3 and issuance of a negative declaration under secret.
Yes. Is that separate votes or all
We can do it all
one? One vote?
Sure.
Someone want to put that motion forward? Anybody?
I can make that motion.
Second? Second. Okay. All in favor? Okay. Rockland County GML review. Again.
You do that.
Thanks, Dave. So the comments that I feel, there's several comments that we already inserted into the comp plan. Those were the minor changes we already went through. There's some comments that frankly just suggested that you do certain things, like put plans online, and they don't talk to the comp plan being amended to do that. The ones that we felt needed to be overridden, 3, 4, 7, and 14. Those, actually, I think there was a more up-to-date one than this.
Yeah, I think the one you sent us last night, the last
Yeah.
page has
That's the one.
Yeah.
I do have this. Yeah. It's 3, 4, 7, 13, 14, and 15. Talk about putting more information into volume 2. Information that the CPC really didn't review, make changes. Again, the volume 2 is solely supposed to be a record of what the CPC reviewed when they were doing the comp plan. We talked about that. We made sure that it was clear. It doesn't carry the force of village policy. That's a statement right in the plan. And so we're not, I'm not suggesting you open that up. Just leave volume 2. Yes.
So 15 actually talks about typographical and format errors. Have we corrected those?
No, I didn't at this point want to make any changes. If you feel that it's important to do that, you could condition an approval upon those changes, but again, I didn't know if it was necessary. I don't even know if those are all of them. I mean, the CPC reviewed every single study in there we reviewed. Yes, there's some typos in there, you know?
Yeah, I mean, like it's volume 2, page 2 indicates the village of Piermont is one of 24 municipalities in Rockland County. It should be corrected to 23. I
Right.
don't see a reason why we need to override that. We're simply correcting an error.
But at the time the CPC was reviewing, it was 24. South Nyack
Right.
was eliminated since the.
But they'll adopt it, let's make that change.
Yeah.
Before it's okay, I think it's.
Is there anything in 15 besides that anybody thinks we need to override? Like one of them is density of 1 unit per 80,000, 1 unit per 40,000. It should say 80,000 in the second place too. That just seems like, housekeeping. Let's make it not that type.
I don't object to that being omitted from the override. I think it'd be fairly easy again, if they want to reopen volume 2.
Yeah, not a minute, just make that change, you
Yeah.
can make the recommended changes, to fix typos.
Okay, so in that instance, I would be recommending overriding 3, 4, 7, 13, and 14, not 15.
And amend 15 as requested by the Rockland County Plan.
Correct, to make the changes.
And you recommend that those numbers get overridden as set forth in your letter dated
April 28, 2025. Rockland County comment 5 was to be more specific about how you're going to increase the range and variety of housing options. Just saying that you're going to expand housing options has generated a comment regarding the potential impacts that that could have. I think it's generic as it is now. I think it's generic. I don't think the idea is to increase densities. I think it's to increase the types of housing, not the densities of housing. I don't think it's going to be an impact, but if you went in and you started reopening this issue, I think that you probably would, at this point, need to do additional seeker. I'm just not suggesting
And
that.
that's assuming they wanted to increase density, there'd be a whole application, there'd be an analysis, there'd be
Yeah.
new seeker, et cetera,
Correct.
which is not contemplated.
It's not contemplated right now, and I'm not suggesting you incorporate it. Rockland County, comment 7, they want the housing needs assessment to be considered for this version of the comp plan. Again, you've done a lot of work here, and I don't know that it makes sense to hold it up for another 6 months to consider this plan. The Rockland County comment 9, regarding viability of non-tourism related businesses, they felt that we should amend that. I think the CPC recommended that based on the input of Chamber of Commerce member that served on the CPC and the experience that they have in the village. And I don't think you should change it because Rockland County disagrees. And it's not really an issue of countywide or intermunicipal importance. So it's sort of beyond their normal jurisdiction. Similarly, there's a recommendation that approaches flexibility by allowing the Board of Trustees to issue a special use permit for a non-residential commercial use that is similar to other uses allowed in the downtown, right? So these come out every now and then. All of a sudden, somebody wants to open up at one point it was an internet cafe, right? At another point, it might have been, you sold it on eBay or whatever use. These things aren't considered or included in the plan. Allowing such a mechanism allows this board to consider it, consider if it's similar, consider if it would have environmental impacts, those kind of matters, and then allow it if it's right for the village. Rockland County Planning felt that the use variance would accomplish the same thing, which I don't think is correct. The use variance is not a tool for land use policy. It's a very rare exception for hardship. And the other thing, option besides this special permit that was recommended was form-based codes. If you want form-based codes, I'd be happy to submit a proposal for that, because it'll probably run you anywhere between $200,000 and $300,000, and I'd be happy to get on it.
And that's not the comp plan now.
That's not on the
They're recommending it.
They're recommending as an alternative to a simple consideration of this board, is it similar to something we already allow? Which is very straightforward. Lastly, comment 11, and also specifically the recommendation is only non-residential uses. So just to be clear. Rockland County comment 11, they wanted you to do an assessment of the school district and talk about services that are available to the public outside of the village. If we had gotten this at the outset of the plan, we might have incorporated it. I do not recommend you hold up your plan to start talking about what the school district facilities are. And those are my recommendations for the overrides.
So do we have a total of the numbers that?
Yeah, override 3.
For motion?
4.
Yeah.
5. 7. 9. 10. 11. 13. And 14.
All right, then we go back. 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14.
Correct. And by the way, you'll have to prepare a report of final action. I can prepare that on your behalf if you'd like. That needs to be sent up to Rockland County Planning after you make your final decision
On the override.
on the override.
Which will largely be the content of this map.
Yes, correct.
Okay, does someone want to make a motion to override county as discussed, 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, 10, 11, 13, and 14?
Before we make that motion, can we just read into the record the ones which we are not overriding?
Sure.
So we've got, number 1, any local laws or zoning amendments proposed for concurrent adoption of the plan must be referred to this department for review as per J&L. Number 2, volume 1, page 4 states the comprehensive plan is a living document and notes that the village board should assess annually what has been accomplished as highlighted by the comprehensive plan and what still needs to be implemented. We recommend the village expand on and formalize this annual review process. So if you were working on language for us to adopt that annual review process, then we'll.
Yes.
Okay. Then we have, no, 5, we had said no. 6, the analysis of community facilities and services in volume 2, page 185, identifies the lack of affordable housing as a significant issue for Piermont Fire Department. The inability for young people to move in Piermont means lower rates of volunteer participation, which limits response time and manpower availability. Many fire department staff members cannot afford to live within Piermont. This issue further emphasizes the need to provide additional housing opportunities and should be reflected in the housing and land use bill. And you address that in one of the proposed amendments, is that correct?
Correct. It's now part of the recommendation for land use chapter.
Then recommendation 8, volume 2, page 88, notes the village does not appear to currently have a climate smart communities coordinator, which could put the village in jeopardy of losing the broad certification. And the ability to pursue silver certification. The need to fill this position should be noted in the discussion of recommendation E15. And I think we actually do have somebody officially on the books right now as that.
Great, okay, well, the comp plan has been recommended to identify that as a vacancy, and that it should be filled, so.
Fair.
Okay.
Then number 12, recommendation K2 states the village will continue to update and modernize the village website and its communication. We commend the village's efforts to provide improved, efficient communication to its citizens. We request the regular uploading of planning board and zoning board of appeals documents to be included in this effort. So that's something that we're agreeing to do as part of not overriding that.
Correct.
And then the last one, 15, is just correct the typos.
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay.
I will make that.
That
Motion.
Okay. Wait. Someone want to second that?
Second.
Christine, all in favor? Piermont comprehensive plan.
Move to that, it's
Moved to that is. Any other comment?
No, that's all.
Okay.
If you want me to be available for questions.
First of all, any questions from that, from the board?
You did a great job here. I feel very confident that we're heading in the right direction with all your careful thought. Thank you.
Just again, I want to clarify, I'm a facilitator,
Mhm.
and the hard work was done by your comprehensive plan committee. I just put it down on paper, you know, and worked with them providing information, but they did the hard work.
You're a great cheerleader.
Yes.
Anyone else want to comment, or before we vote?
I would actually just make the recommendation that we put in the stipulation, that we also eliminate item D6 as a recommendation. We can give up D1 because it could cause problems. I think D6 is the one that's getting the most problematic attention.
D6 is a recommendation with regard to the Business B district, that it be amended, or I believe we use consider to be amended, in a manner that would reflect the current built environment of downtown. This was something we worked with the committee, with the verbiage to make sure that they were on board. But you know, it will cause controversy. It will expose you to risk. You know, apart from all the background on this, you know, I have a hard time identifying how making your zoning consistent with the way something is already built could result in environmental impact. I understand the history, I understand where the controversy comes from, but ultimately, I think you do have to address the fact that your zoning requires 30-foot front yards right here on Piermont Avenue. And none of those buildings have 30-foot front yards on Piermont Avenue.
Your risk is lawsuit risk, the public suit.
That is correct, the risk.
Okay.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about physical risk.
So
Frankly, you have-
the concept of this was to make the zoning indicate what is presently there, and to have density requirements to reduce density.
Correct.
Okay.
Not to reduce density, to set density based on what you already have. And frankly, it's somewhere in the range of 50%. You know, I think when we originally talked about it, we thought it was an 80%. It's actually in 50%, meaning that several of the buildings exceed 2,500 square feet of lot area per dwelling.
So in it, you changed the word and consider it for the future of to make it, as a good planner, to make what's there now legal. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, so again, this is a district that encompasses, I believe it's about 16 and a half acres. And almost all of it's non-compliant to the existing code. Every single building there, if you were to have a fire and want to reconstruct it, I believe your non-conforming doesn't allow when damages are more than 100% to be reconstructed. All of them would have to go for variances, and all of them would receive variances. And that's sort of the other part of this, is that it's so different from what's, you might as well skip the planning board and go to the zoning board first, because you're getting a front yard variance, you're getting a building height variance, you're getting a variance for all the things that the zoning is not doing. So in a way, you've given over your ability to regulate the zoning to the zoning board, who just has to consider not what the law says, but what everybody else in the district is currently doing. So again, I think you've heard me on this before. I think the public has heard, and I didn't mean to necessarily disagree with your perspective.
No, you're 100% correct about all of it. My
Yeah.
concern is just that this is our opportunity to remove something that seems to be problematic for our constituents, and why not take the opportunity?
Max, what are the inherent risks? You know, if somebody wanted to come in and build in our fair village here, with all the inconsistencies we have in our zoning laws, what could they do to us? Do they have an open door now because we're not consistent?
I wouldn't say it's open door. I just think, again, when you go to the planning board opens up the code book. And if it says 30-foot front yard, and you're not providing a 30-foot front yard, they can't approve you, period. It's end. They're not allowed to approve you. Then you go to the zoning board, and the zoning board says, take the code, put it to the side, let's look at the character of the community, let's look at whether the hardship is self-created, which is informative but not mandatory in their judgments, and the other types of considerations that the zoning board makes, which are quasi-judicial, not planning related and not ministerial. So it's like you're rolling the dice a little bit when you're relying on your zoning board to regulate land use. I think it's not good policy. I don't think it's good planning policy. But the reality is, if that's, that is one part of a very large and important plan, right? And, the reality is, I don't know that recommendation, whether you have it in or out, is it gonna make a great difference? No, it probably won't. The same thing is gonna happen, it's gonna take a different process, right? Meaning, like, if somebody wants to build in the downtown, instead of complying with zoning, now they're gonna go to the zoning board. So,
But at some point, we have to deal with making our zoning somewhat consistent. And we have to address everybody's concerns.
That's the idea, is that, again, I can't imagine an impact that says, okay, if everybody in the downtown, or let's say 80% of properties in the downtown have a 0-foot front yard, and you change your zoning to require a 0-foot front yard instead of a 30-foot front yard, there's no impact. The impact would be you're saving people from having to go to the zoning board, and not so much on the 0 front yards, but on other matters. If you require a 10-foot side yard, and there's a lot of people with 8-foot side yards, the zoning board can deny that. The zoning board could say, well, everybody's got 8, we only require you to have 10, we're gonna stay hard on that. But when you require 30 and everybody has 8 and somebody asks for 10, now you can't deny it. That's my
Yeah,
interpretation.
what it does is it's gonna lead to bad redevelopment, it's gonna lead to lawsuits that if it's denied, Article 78 is brought by homeowners and tie you up with a lot of litigation by the threat that the concept of having consistent zoning is a bad thing, because there's some project out there that may or may not be subject to that zone. It is what it is.
I just want to clarify a little bit, it's not my intention to say here that we should not make our zoning consistent with the built environment. What I'm trying to say is that I think we should strike it from this draft that we're trying to adopt and consider it in the future.
I have no problem with that, anybody else?
As long as we deal with it at some point.
Yeah, all right. So,
With the other changes there, other than removing D6 as a recommendation, and the other amendments as recommended by Council Cole today? Yeah, that's that next thing, right? That's what we want.
Yeah, the ones that we
yeah,
had.
yeah, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, we were talking about.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're striking, what is it, D6? Strike D6.
And renumbering the rest of the time.
Just the D section.
Yep. Okay. Nate, since he was the chair, do you want to make a motion to adopt the Piermont comprehensive plan like discussed?
I'm happy to make that motion with the stipulations that have been discussed.
Okay.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max.
And I'll be back in a month with some zoning.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Motion to adjourn? All in favor? Aye. Thank you very much.
Sure.